Hi everyone, this is Heather Lottinen from the Flourish Academy. This is episode 465, and today I wanted to give you my first impressions on the Nikon Z6 mirrorless. Now, I've only had this camera for a few days and I haven't used it on a real shoot. I have just been photographing around my home and such and testing lenses, so that's why this video is my first impressions. I really can't say a lot about a camera until I actually shoot a client session, or better yet, even a wedding, but haven't had a chance to do that yet, so just wanted to give you my first impressions. Now, why do I have the camera open to the air like this? Yes, I do want to get a lens on this quickly. I have a bunch of gear here beside me because I wanted to show you the difference in the size of the opening from the D750 to the Z6 mirrorless. Obviously, you can tell that the Z6 has a larger opening, which Nikon is talking about allowing more light into the sensor, which is fantastic, but you have to have lenses that work with that size. So for instance, this is going to be really great when they come out with their, I think it's a 58.95, it's f.95 lens, which will really take advantage of the size of the opening of this camera. So that's great, but it's not a huge advantage just yet until those lenses are released. Now, it's my understanding, I need to get a lens on this camera. I don't like having it exposed like that. It's my understanding that that f.95 lens, which I think would be amazing, is manual focus only, which means for me, it's out. I rely heavily on autofocus. It's not that I can't manual focus, it's just that I'm not that fast, and I think the camera does a really good job on autofocus. So the size of the opening of the camera, while Nikon will talk about it being a huge deal, and I suppose down the road it will be, it's really not that big of a deal just yet. So I have the 24-70 f4 mounted on the camera, and that is the new mount. So I don't have the adapter. This is native to this camera. I was shooting with this yesterday and I found it to be very quick and responsive. And let me tell you some things I really enjoy about this camera. If you shoot Nikon, then this is just gonna feel like an old friend. It's very comfortable. The menu systems are almost identical. The buttons are in similar places. So if you're used to shooting Nikon and you love Nikon and you're thinking about upgrading to mirrorless or trying out mirrorless, then the Z6 is an absolute no-brainer because you could move to it really easily and it wouldn't take a lot to learn where some of the different features are because most of them are the same. I will say there's one thing that I was like, oh, where is that button? So you'll notice there's no button here on the side of this camera. I'm used to shooting with my, hold on, I'm gonna put a lens back on this camera. With the Nikon Z750, D750, and I use this button a lot to switch between the continuous servo and single servo modes. So that button isn't on the Z6, which means it's a menu item. Menu items kind of drive me crazy because it takes me a second to find them, so I'm not crazy about that. Everything else you can turn on, and I just picked up my Fuji. That's hilarious. You can turn on and feel very comfortable with this camera because the dials are very similar, so it wouldn't take much to learn how to use it. If you also shoot Nikon and you're just in the Nikon ecosystem and you have a lot of lenses, then this camera makes a lot of sense with the FTZ adapter. Now, my degree is mechanical engineering, and I'm always skeptical of adapters because you have to take something that doesn't natively work with something else and make it work. So I'm always like, oh, I'm not sure. But actually, there are no moving parts in this adapter. All it does essentially is extend the flange distance so that those lenses fit. So I shot with this today. I shot with my 50-1.4 and this adapter on the Z6, and it performed beautifully. I didn't notice any delay in focusing or any trouble in focusing. It just worked, no problem. But then I put my Tamron 70-200 on the adapter, and it did work. It focused. It seemed a little slow and sketchy to me. It was like, it was like struggling a little bit, but in all fairness, I just took a few shots. Again, I haven't used it on a real shoot, so until I get it outside and I'm shooting a client like I normally would, I can't really say for sure. I just felt like it was a little bit off. It focused, it worked, it's great, that's fine. So this works. Again, if you're in the Nikon ecosystem and you're looking at mirrorless, the Z6 is a no-brainer because it's very similar to the D750. Now, I have to wonder, right now, as of this date, is there any reason to purchase a new D850 or 750? Well, I would say definitely not to the D850. I was never a fan of that camera. I did some reviews last year. I thought it was heavy, it was clunky to me, it just didn't work for me. A lot of people love it, that's fine. That's just my opinion. So if it were between like, oh, should I purchase a Nikon D850 or mirrorless? Oh my goodness, 100% the Z6. It's so much lighter, and I think it's gonna perform better than the D850. I don't have a D850, so I can't say that with certainty, but that's just a feeling I have. Just shooting with it, you know, the little bit that I have, shot in manual mode, I shot in aperture priority. I enjoyed that. There's a screen on the top. That's fine. We have exposure compensation here, which I use all the time in aperture priority. ISO button is up here, so ISO is a button plus the command dial. We have the toggle on the back, and obviously there are a ton of custom functions, but I was experimenting last night with my son and the touch screen on the back, and I was using the touch screen to focus and take a photo. And I think you can change the way that operates, but it worked pretty well. So I would just like touch on his face and boom, it would focus and take the photo, which I thought was pretty interesting. So if I had to choose, if you were thinking, should I pick up a D750 versus a Z6? I mean, my personal opinion is that I would go with the Z6. I would go with the latest technology, with mirrorless. Okay, there is some controversy over the one card slot versus the dual card slots. So this only has one card slot. It is an XQD card, which is said to be much more reliable than SD or CF cards. It's definitely faster. I think you would have a really hard time outrunning the buffer on this camera. So if you photograph sports or wildlife in the form of children, then, you know, fast moving is what I'm saying. I don't think you can outrun the buffer. I suppose at some point you could. But these XQD cards are so fast that if you, even with your finger just on that shutter, just like bam, 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 it's writing so quickly from the buffer to the XQD that I just don't think you would ever have an issue with that. So XQD cards are significantly faster, which is better for video as well. So I'm a fan of the XQD cards. Okay, but let's talk about the single card slot. Now listen, I've been shooting weddings for 16 years, and up until recently, we only had one card slot. So we were really used to dealing with that type of risk. And by the way, we were shooting with old style CF cards that were way more prone to failure. And I never had a failure ever that was catastrophic. I did have corrupt cards, but I was always able to recover them. Okay, so that being said, I was always fine with a single card slot because that's all we had. When we got introduced to two card slots, as a professional, I was like, man, that's awesome because it's just redundancy and I love backup. Okay, now that I know dual card slots exist, going back to a single card slot, I'm kind of like, really, Nikon? Really? You could have put two in there? I mean, is it a deal breaker? No, I mean, because again, we were shooting with single card slots. That's completely up to you. If it's a deal breaker for you, then don't buy the camera. But unless you shoot weddings, I don't know that it really matters. It's just really nice to have dual card slots. So to go from not ever having them to having them and then not having them again, I don't know, it just feels kind of like a step backwards to me. So I'm used to my dual card slots on both my Nikon D750 and my Fuji X-T3, so it's kind of become my thing. That, I wouldn't say it's a deal breaker for me, but it causes me to pause for a second and think, oh, I don't know, does that really matter? I would say for most portrait professional photographers, no, it doesn't matter. Because again, you were shooting cameras 4 years with a single card slot. And again, the error rate on the XQD cards is really low. Now, I didn't do the research or the data. I've never had a corrupt XQD card because I've never shot with one. In over 16 years, I've only had, I would say maybe 2 or 3 corrupt SD cards. And again, they were always recoverable. So card failure for the most part is pretty rare. But with XQD cards, I think it's even more rare. But only time will tell how those perform. Okay, conclusion on this camera, I think it's great. I think if you love Nikon and you are in the ecosystem, you have the lenses, then pick up this camera with the FTZ adapter and adapt all of your lenses, and you'll be off and running with mirrorless. I did experiment a little bit with the mechanical shutter versus the silent shutter, and it's so funny. It just must be like what I'm used to. I like the noise of the shutter. I like hearing that, you know, clunk. I like that. So when I put it on silent shutter, I was like all tripped out. It was difficult for me to shoot that way, but it's a huge advantage in venues like weddings, right? Or anything where you need things to be super quiet. So I would definitely use it, but I think I would leave it on mechanical just because I like that noise, which I thought was interesting. I did not have a chance to experiment with video on this yet, but the specs are amazing, and they just did a firmware update, or it's forthcoming. I mean, it either happened a couple days ago or it's like about to happen, where they have put face and eye detect in the autofocus. There were a couple of things that I couldn't find. Let me rephrase. Took me a second to find them. You can press I on the back of the camera to get these common settings. Like I do change my focus modes between single servo and continuous servo, and getting to that is like, it's like a button and then an arrow and then a dial. That just feels like a whole bunch of movement to me. I was shooting this in, they have different sizes of RAW, which I like. Large RAW, medium RAW, small RAW. I think there's an advantage to that. I didn't shoot it in JPEG yet or compare it against my Fuji. Again, I've only had it for a few days, so I haven't had a chance to test it extensively. But if you're asking me, do I like this camera and should you buy it? If you like Nikon and you want to get into mirrorless and you're used to buttons and dials in the Nikon system, then no brainer. For the price, it's amazing. Get the kit, pick up the adapter, and you'll be off and running. Okay, all of that said, if you're asking me my personal opinion, which by the way, I am entitled to, I still prefer the mechanics on my Fuji X-T3. And the reason is, maybe I'm old school, I like having access to all of my settings via these dials on the top. So you'll notice there's no shooting mode on the Fuji because everything's a dial. You set the shutter speed, the aperture on the lens, the ISO, exposure compensation, it's all a dial right on the top of the camera. Now I am used to shooting with my Nikon D750 where things are menu items or they're dials. So the Z6 has that. I've just really been enjoying setting everything manually myself using these different dials. And by the way, people are sometimes confused, like, oh wait, I have to set everything on that camera. No, you don't, because the shutter dial has an A for auto, ISO has an A for auto, and aperture has an A for auto. If you put it all in A, you're in auto mode. If you change the shutter speed, you're in shutter priority. If you change the aperture and the shutter speed, you're in manual. If you change just the aperture, leave the shutter speed in auto, you are in aperture priority. It's just, you do that by setting the dials, not by setting a shooting mode. And I do that on my Nikon all the time. It's not a problem. It's just, I enjoy this. Okay, so the point to that is you have to pick up these cameras and shoot with them and at least a little bit to see what works for you, because it largely becomes personal preference. I didn't have any trouble switching over to Fuji and learning their system. It was easy and fun to me, and I think it gave me a kick in creativity. But for some people, that would be overwhelming. So they want to stay with either Nikon or Canon or whatever they're shooting. My recommendation to you is to head out to your local camera store, and in our case, that's YM Camera, and pick these up, and actually just, they'll let you shoot around the store with them. They even have demo models or cameras that you can rent. So this is one of their demos. I need to get it back to them. So if you guys show up at the store, you can play with it. But you need to pick these up and mess around with them and see what you think. I will tell you one thing I do like on the Z6 over my Fuji is, do you notice the difference in the eyepiece in terms of the distance from the back of the camera? When you put it up to your face, so some people will say, this is really nice, this is bigger. This is a larger distance between the eyepiece and the back of the camera versus the Fuji, You can see the distance there. I don't have numbers. Or, oh my goodness, the D750 is completely flush. I think there is a huge advantage to having that eyepiece set away from the back of the camera. So some people will say, I have a big nose, so that's really important to me. Okay, I don't have a big nose, but I wear makeup. And when I shoot with my D750, it ends up getting covered in makeup throughout the day. And putting this up to my face, that doesn't happen because of that distance. So it's little ergonomic things like that that might make a difference in your shooting, but you wouldn't notice it until you picked up the camera, you spent some time playing with all of the dials, all of the buttons, putting it up to your face, experimenting with the electronic viewfinder, which might feel different to you than your optical viewfinder of your DSLR, if that's what you're used to, versus using the back of the camera or live view, or what does that look like? It's so funny. I have found lately that when I'm shooting a wider lens on my mirrorless, I've been using this a lot. I've been using it the back of the screen in live view, which is so weird because I typically don't like that, and I never use it on my D750. Never, ever, ever have I done that. But when I'm shooting telephoto lenses, I tend to look through the eyepiece, and I'm loving the electronic viewfinders on both the Z6 and the Fuji X-T3 because you can see your exposure before you take the photo, which means as I'm looking through here, I can make adjustments with my shutter speed and my aperture, get the exposure right because I can physically see it, and then take the photo and just be off and running. So there's a huge advantage in having an electronic viewfinder. I hope that you found this useful. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll see you in the next video.